if the police give information which turns out not to be true, then you lose confidence in the police and you no longer believe them when they say things like there's nothing to suggest it was politically motivated. That may be literally true, but people understand this to be a hint that there's nothing to see here, we can move on. So it's very dangerous for them to say anything at all in these circumstances. If they don't know, much better, as everybody has said so far, much better to say nothing specific.
The involvement of Counterterrorism Police in this investigation is, of course, a significant change. On Sunday, the Devon and Cornwall Police Assistant Chief Constable said there was no information to suggest terrorism and nothing to suggest it was politically motivated. That has, of course, since changed. Let's bring in now the legal commentator and KC, Joshua Rozenberg. Joshua, good morning.
Good morning, Q.
So, look, if we look back at how this has panned out, did the police break one of the golden rules of investigations here, not to comment on live investigations in case new facts emerge? Did they, by basically saying that there were no facts to support this, comment on an investigation themselves?
They did qualify what they said, and to be fair to the police, when they first spoke to journalists, they were probably referring to the first person they arrested, the first suspect, who was released shortly afterwards, clearly the wrong person. And so what they said in those circumstances was probably correct. But on the other hand, as you've just reported, and as the Times says today, on Sunday, after the second arrest, Mac Longman, an Assistant Chief Constable of Devon and Cornwall Police, said there was no information to suggest terrorism and nothing to suggest it was politically motivated. Now, that may be the case as far as Devon and Cornwall Police were concerned, but it probably went too far, and I think everybody who's criticised the Devon and Cornwall Police for saying things which were understood by the public to mean don't worry, this is not a terrorist case, this is not a political case. That was clearly a misjudgment by the police.
Yeah, sure. Look, what kind of thing would force this change? What sort of thing would instigate the counter-terror police to take over proceedings?
Once they had arrested the suspect who is in custody, that gave them the power to search his home. And presumably items they found in his home, and you've already referred this morning to what's been reported in the press, will have led them to believe that this was not just a random attack on somebody, but motivated by other causes. And that's what clearly is bringing in the counterterrorism police. That's why they're investigating.
Okay. I mean, the police, obviously, they have a tricky line to walk. Since the unrest over cases such as Axel Ruda Cabana's a few years ago, authorities have been pressured to release additional information to the public earlier than usual. And indeed, all the reporting of this, we kept hearing a white male has been arrested. It seemed to be very important to the police to put that out. Do you think, was that the intention behind the early briefings we had for in this case, for example, with sort of suspects' nationalities, and indeed with the lack of an obvious, at first, political motive?
I'm sure that's right. The police approach seems to be rather rigid, doesn't it? They are now permitted to say a person's colour and obviously whether it's a man or a woman, ethnicity, whatever it may be, but that's as far as the rules currently allow them to go. And that is clearly to give the public a better idea and to avoid the sort of rioting that we saw in Southport. Now, the problem is that if the police give information which turns out not to be true, then you lose confidence in the police and you no longer believe them when they say things like there's nothing to suggest it was politically motivated. That may be literally true, but people understand this to be a hint that there's nothing to see here, we can move on. So it's very dangerous for them to say anything at all in these circumstances. If they don't know, much better, as everybody has said so far, much better to say nothing specific.
But I mean, you know, when they are questioned, I mean, so speaking to Times Radio, Reform spokesperson Gawain Towler said that saying one thing and then redacting it is going to deepen public mistrust in the police, which is obviously true. But I'm just keen to understand how they could have handled this better. Because if they were asked whether there's a political connection, they can either say, and they're not aware of one, they can either say not that we're aware of, or they can say not that we're aware of yet, but that makes it sound like they're expecting to become aware of one, or they can say no comment, which makes people think, well, they're hiding something. What ought they to be doing?
It is very difficult, isn't it? And it is a matter of tone. I think all they can do is what you get when you interview people and they don't want to comment, which is to answer a different question, to say, we're investigating all lines of inquiry, we have no information at the moment, it's early stages in the investigation, and that sort of thing. Now, that's, a brush-off for reporters, but much better to brush off and say nothing. Yes, you're quite right, no comment could be misinterpreted. Best to say, look, we're working on this. We would be grateful for any closed-circuit TV that people have found, any information that people have. Here's our hotline, anything really, but not to say something which the public will understand as meaning that this is not a political or a terrorist case when they can't be sure of that in the circumstances.
When the media covers cases like this, Joshua, I mean, journalists normally have at least a sort of a working understanding of what can be said when and what shouldn't be said when, albeit, I'm the first to admit it's often not nearly as good as it ought to be. But on social media, the public generally doesn't have that knowledge. Has that changed the territory enormously? Because when stuff isn't said, when information is being withheld, generally, you can see across social media huge amounts of public rage, and anybody who tries to defend the police in the handling sort of becomes party to that rage, which is why you can see why some politicians end up sort of feeding that rage a little bit. Has social media just made this vastly more difficult?
Yes, certainly. Absolutely right. Strictly speaking, when a case is active, when somebody's being questioned, you're not really meant to say anything at all. We still haven't named the suspect who's being questioned, and that's because the police have not named this person. I dare say some journalists have found out who this person is, but very properly they're not naming this person, in case, of course, this person is released and is not found to be in any way involved in the investigation. There have been occasions in the past where somebody's been arrested, the press have jumped to conclusion, and as a result of that they've had to pay out huge libel damages. So people are being cautious in the mainstream media, and rightly so. Now, it's perfectly true, the same law applies to people on social media. They perhaps don't know this, people who post all sorts of things, some speculative, some may be accurate, but they are bound by the same laws. But of course those laws are very, very difficult to enforce against hundreds of thousands of people who say things on social media. It is tricky, and what one can say about the politicians is that they understand the law. They certainly should understand the law. They make the law, and they should understand how to behave responsibly. They should do nothing to feed or encourage social media. They should behave responsibly, as the Speaker warned MPs to in the Commons chamber yesterday, and as I think they did in Parliament. So it's very important that people do not exacerbate the situation, because sooner or later somebody is going to say, look, I couldn't get a fair trial. Somebody is going to say it wasn't me, and they will be acquitted.
Somebody like Nigel Farage now, Joshua, will say, well, he did speculate about this case, he did suggest things about this case, but he's turned out to be vindicated. Whereas I guess the point is, whether he's right or not, he simply shouldn't have said it.
Well, we don't know, to be perfectly honest, if he's vindicated or not. He may well think he is vindicated, and that may well turn out to be the case. But nobody's been charged, let alone convicted, and nobody knows what aspects of the investigation the police are working on, and what damage to an investigation may be caused by speculation, particularly speculation from somebody in a position of authority. Yeah. So the best thing to do is to say as little as possible, let the police get on with their job. It's frustrating, of course it's frustrating. We'll want to know what this is about, and we'll want to know who was responsible for a dreadful crime. But in the circumstances, the best thing, I'm afraid, is to let the police get on with it.
Joshua Rozenberg, thank you very much indeed. Andy Silvester is still with me. Andy, just before we move on, we've had a message while I was talking to Joshua from Pete, which I'm not going to read all of it, although it's a very sort of well written message, but it's quite long. But he basically begins by saying, as a retired cop, I'm livid at the coverage that the police have cocked up the Widdecombe investigation. They released a statement saying there was nothing to suggest a political motivation because this was true at the time. And he basically goes on to say that they did that because they knew politicians and the public, and he named some politicians, would be speculating by like crazy. Basically a fairly strong defence of the police there.
I have some sympathy with that opinion. You alluded earlier to the Southport incidents, the riots after the police were perceived as not giving enough information. There is clearly a desire across police forces in the United Kingdom now to get more information out there as quickly as possible, because we live in a world that is fractious. We live in a world where frankly, ethnic divides are more apparent than they have been in the past. We live in a more politically aggressive society than we have for some time, driven in large part by some politicians, driven in large part by simply the mechanisms of social media. So I do have quite a lot of sympathy with the police just trying to be as upfront and open as possible. But I think you can still acknowledge the effort and the motivation behind it while still saying that the language was, I think, overly definitive. And of course now is going to lead to a political firestorm this week.
Yeah, like it always does.